Hey, before we begin, I'd like to invite my subscribers to receive my free Excel spreadsheet-based voltage drop calculator. Just send me an email at the address in my channel contact information. If I can see you in my subscribers list, I'll send it right out to you. This is a limited time offer, but the time limit is informal, so there's a lot of flexibility there. And you might like to have it to follow along in part 2 of What, the Voltage Drop? I'll be showing you how it works and how helpful it can be when you're designing a new power circuit. It's also filled with additional user aids as well. Okay, let's get to doing some voltage drop calculations. Welcome back, friends. This is part 2 of a series. Some of the demonstration results from part 1 didn't sit right with me. I wanted to present the most accurate information I can. My voltage drop measurements weren't working very well in the voltage drop calculator. So I reviewed my raw video footage and recorded several sample voltage readings from each segment. I averaged those readings in an attempt to be more accurate. I also felt like my guesstimated conductor length wasn't good enough. So I measured it from my main panel to my outbuilding. I guesstimated 10 feet to provide for rise and drop on both ends. The error in that isn't significant. After all that follow-up work I did, I'm convinced my original inefficiency calculation was good. The water heater is still operating at 467 watts below its rating. And based on my review of my voltage drop calculations versus the pretty sketchy real-world measurements I was able to take, even though nothing's perfect, I think the calculations are a good tool to use. Although I secretly wish I could measure the resistance on every long piece of wire I use. To show you how this calculation is done, I'm jumping right into working on an example. I'll explain what I'm doing as I go. Okay, let's say we're sizing a feeder for an outbuilding, like a garage or pole barn, that's 100 feet from the main panel. Meaning it will take 100 feet of wire to reach the barn sub-panel. So the barn is like 80 plus feet from the house. We can use the NEC 2020, page 70-705, chapter 9, table 8, to find conductor resistance values in ohms per kFT. That's ohms per 1,000 feet. We're using the columns for uncoated copper or aluminum. We'll have to divide the ohms per kFT value by 1,000 to get the ohms per foot value. Then we simply multiply the ohms per foot by the length of the wire run in feet. Make sense? So the voltage drop equation looks like this. Voltage drop equals amps times 2 times the distance times ohms per 1,000 feet. Do you still see the Ohm's law equation in there? Basically, we're calculating the ohms value in the volts equals amps times ohms equation by dividing the value we referenced in table 8 by 1,000 to get the number of ohms per foot of conductor. Then we're multiplying ohms per foot by the number of feet of wire in the circuit. Let's continue working our example. Suppose we've selected number 2 copper for our 240 volt, 100 amp, 100 foot long circuit. Don't get nervous, this isn't an economics question. Don't worry about using copper, let's just think about the math. You can do the calculation for aluminum as homework. From table 8, uncoated number 2 stranded copper has 0.194 ohms per thousand feet of resistance. Now we just plug and chug. 100 amps times 2 times 100 feet times 0.194 over 1,000 equals 3.88 volts dropped. Now remember, that's 3.88 volts that are consumed by resistance in the wires, which reduces your original 240 volt supply. Now, what's our voltage drop percentage? Okay, no offense, but some of us need a little refresher on figuring fractions and percentages. Here's a little thought exercise. We all know 1/4 is 25%, but how is that calculated? 1/4 is the same as saying 1/4 or 1 divided by 4, and that works out to 0.25. That's a fraction expressed as a decimal. Now multiply that fraction of 100% by 100% to get the percent value of 25%. Now let's look at how that applies when the numbers aren't so obvious. Think of it as we dropped 3.88 volts of the original 240 volts. So 3.88 of 240, rounded off, that divides out to 0.01617. Then take 0.01617 of 100% to get our answer. This 240 volt circuit has only 1.62% voltage drop. That's very acceptable. Now let's add a branch circuit to our barn. Maybe we want an electric furnace in there. Let's add a 50 amp branch circuit for that in our sub panel. We'll use number 8 copper conductors rated at 50 amps, and they'll be 75 feet long. So the furnace will have to be drawing a maximum continuous load of 40 amps. Now we could just look up the ohms per thousand feet and plug and chug like we did before. But let's have a look at this spreadsheet I made to do these calculations. Now let's work with the voltage drop calculator. I'll point out and describe some of the features of this spreadsheet as they come up. But here's a general overview. There's 2 voltage drop calculators on this spreadsheet. Over here, if you see my mouse pointer moving around in the upper left area here, this top area here is for the feeder circuit voltage drop calculation, or the branch circuit if you're just doing a branch circuit, and I'll explain. The bottom area here is for a branch circuit with a calculated feeder. So this calculates your branch circuit voltage drop after you've calculated your feeder. If you can't calculate your feeder voltage drop because the feeder's already been installed, it's pre-existing, it is what it is, then you use the top calculator here to calculate your branch circuit. And it would be a good idea to take a voltage measurement at the main panel, right on the main breaker, and enter that in down here. So we've come to these color-coded input fields. So green is where you would enter your system voltage. And it can be just theoretical, 240 or 120 or whatever. In my house, I happen to know it's 242.5 because I just measured it. And then you can enter in your amps. And so here's our example of 100 amps. And you can just change that to whatever value you need. So amps is red. Brown is the length of your conductors in feet. One-way trip. Right, so we had a 100-foot run in our example. That's multiplied times 2. Then the next field here is blue, and that's ohms from table 8. That's ohms per 1,000 feet from table 8. And if we look at table 8, let's see, we were using a number 2 copper conductor. So that's 0.194 ohms per 1,000 feet. That's already in there, but you can put in whatever value you need. 0.194. And it automatically calculates the voltage drop. It's 3.88 volts. So my 242.5 volt service has lost 3.88 volts, and that's 1.6% voltage drop. That 3.88 volts that is lost is subtracted from the 242.5, and that becomes the system voltage out at your panel, at your sub panel. So here it's just automatically entered 238.6. You can't change that field. That's automatically calculated by subtracting your voltage drop from your system voltage. So if that's just 240, I'll put in 240 there. You'll see the voltage drop changes, or the system voltage at the panel changes. So we have 1.62% voltage drop at the end of our 100-foot long feeder. And so then, if you remember, we added a 50 amp branch circuit 75 feet away. That gets multiplied times 2. And that was number 8 copper. So number 8 copper stranded and uncoated is 0.778 ohms per 1,000 feet. That's already in there. So this gets calculated out automatically as soon as you hit enter. And the voltage that's dropped there is 5.835 volts, which is automatically copied down here. It's displayed rounded, but Excel works with the non-rounded number in the background. And so it's 5.8 volts of 236.1 volts equals 0.0247. That's multiplied times 100% to get our 2.47% voltage drop. So remember now, the NEC suggests that we limit our total voltage drop to 5%, and in this case we have 2.47% voltage drop on our branch circuit, and we had 1.62% voltage drop on our feeder. And if we add those two percentages up, I carried them up here on the right here, and the total is 4.09% voltage drop. So that's how this calculator works. One of the nice things about having a calculator like this is that it makes it easy to do what ifs. You know, ask questions, what if, like what if we're installing a 20 amp branch circuit and we need to know the ohms per 1,000 feet on 12 gauge, and that's 1.98. Put that in, ohms per 1,000 feet. So this is kind of cool. Oh, and it's going to be a 120 volt circuit, let's say. Well, look what happened here. These fields, these percent fields went black. Basically, they're so far out of range that they're just blacked out. We wanted 3% or less here, and it's 6% or more, so it's blacked out. We wanted 5% or less up here, and it's more than 10%, so it's blacked out. So we have a real problem here. We can't run this 20 amp circuit 100 feet at 120 volts because it loses 7.9 volts, and that's more than 6%. So what is the length of a wire run we can do with 12 gauge wire running 20 amps? Let's try 75 feet. So these are what ifs. What if we ran 75 feet? So it's Now it's 4.95%. That's still out of the range we're looking for, but it's below double the 3%. So now it's red. Let's go to, let's say 65 feet. We're still too far out there. What if we try 55 feet? We're still above 3% voltage drop. 50 feet? No. 40 feet? Oh, there, we're below 3% at 40 feet. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? This is telling us that a 20 amp circuit, well, 20 amps on 12 gauge wire doesn't go more than, let's see, basically 45 feet. Here's 46 feet. Yeah, 46 feet is too far. 45.5 feet maybe. Perfect 3%. That's as far as you can go on a 20 amp circuit. Just 45 feet on 12 gauge Romex. Well, I don't know. If we think about it, on these circuits, we're never running 100% amperage on the circuits. They're sized to hold 20 amps, for example. But they don't run 20 amps all the time. That wouldn't work anyway. Let's try 80% of that, which is 16 amps. And most of the time you're probably not running 80% of 20 amps on your 20 amp circuit. So that brings it into range, a more reasonable range of 2.4%. And so actually we can stretch that wire length out a little bit. How about 50 feet? 55? Yeah, that says we're still less than 3%. We can go 55 feet. What about 60? No. That's too far. $57 is too far. How about 56.5 feet? We can go about 56.5 feet on that 12 gauge that's protected by a 20 amp breaker. Because unless you know you're going to be running more than 16 amps on that circuit all the time, that's more reality right there. But if you insist on designing your voltage drop at the maximum amperage on the conductor, then by all means it's better to do that. And 56 feet won't fly. How about 45? Yeah. 45.5? Yeah, that works. So these what ifs are kind of interesting to do. Now, what if this was a 240 volt circuit? I have an air compressor that's 240 volts and it runs on a 20 amp circuit. Well, look at that. At 240 volts, it's only 1.5% voltage drop. So what if I wanted to determine how far away I can plug in my 240 volt air compressor out in my barn? It's 240 volts. It's on a 20 amp circuit, which could be 12 gauge wire. And I can take that out probably 90 feet. 90 feet away. 90 feet away is still good. That's far beyond anything I would ever need. But you can get the picture here how these what ifs can help you design your system. So what if we had that 100 amp circuit we were trying to run on a 240 volt system? How far out can we go with that cable length? We're at 100 feet and 1.62% voltage drop. Let's go to 150. That's a 300 foot round trip for the conductors. Now we have 2.43% voltage drop, which is still acceptable. What if we go to 200 feet? Now we're at 3.23% voltage drop, and that's too much. But again, if we consider reality, we won't be running 100 amps through that system all the time, or ever. So let's try 80% of that. 80 amps. And the voltage drop is still acceptable, even at 200 feet out. What if we go to 225 feet? Still good. How about if we go to 250 feet? That's too far out. That really is too far out. Let's try 230 feet. So we can actually go 230 feet out with that. But let's try another what if situation. In this case, we've got to realize that we're not always going to be running 240 volts out there. A lot of the time we'll just be running our 120 volt circuit for lights or something. Half of our 240, so we'll change the system to 240. And that says our voltage drop is way above 3%. But we're not going to be running 120 volts at 80 amps, so let's get that into reality. We might be running it at the most ever, I'd say 40 amps. So that distance is still pretty safe. Our voltage drop still looks acceptable. How many amps can we pull on that thing? Not 50. Not 45. As long as we're like 40 amps of 120, that would both be on the same leg. If we're 40 amps but we have a 20 amps on one leg and 20 amps on the other, then that's really 40 amps on 240. So it can be interesting to look at these what-if situations. Just plug in the numbers and see what happens. So, is there anything else you need to know right now? Unfortunately, if you end up increasing your circuit conductor size to reduce your voltage drop, there's another NEC requirement you need to know about. Article 250.122b says this: 250.122, size of equipment grounding conductors, B, increased in size. If ungrounded conductors are increased in size for any reason other than is required in 310.15b or 310.15c, wire type equipment grounding conductors, if installed, shall be increased in size proportionately to the increase in circular mill area of the ungrounded conductors. This means that since you've increased your conductor size to reduce voltage drop, you also have to increase the size of the equipment grounding conductor you install with your power conductors. This increase is proportional to the circular mill area increase you made to the hot conductors. So I have some comments to make in closing. First, I actually used this other voltage drop calculation method, shown here, to validate the Ohm's law method I prefer. I tested multiple examples with both methods and their results are virtually identical. Whichever one you choose really appears to be a matter of personal preference. Second, while these two voltage drop calculation methods provide the same theoretical results, I discovered a bit more discrepancy with the practical world. In my real-world presentation of voltage drop measurements in Part 1, my measured total voltage drop turned out pretty different from my calculated results. That's why I went to all the trouble to do a physical measurement of my wire run and to calculate average voltage readings from my raw video record. After all that work, I still found there's a discrepancy between the voltage drop experiment and the calculated theoretical voltage drop. As any scientist, engineer, or technician knows, that's to be expected. Based on my one flawed experiment, the discrepancy works in our favor, meaning the voltage drop was actually less than what was calculated. But whatever the case may be, I added a correction factor to my spreadsheet calculations. If I find I want to add a margin for error, I'll consider using a correction factor of 1.1 or 1.2, that's 10 or 20%, going forward to minimize my voltage drop. I will say, if you're concerned about compromising your calculated voltage drop, then use the full circuit amperage and forget about the reduced amperage in actual use like I showed. There's something else I should point out. These calculations that ignore AC reactance are okay for use up to a 1-aught conductor. If you need a 2-aught conductor or larger, you'll need to calculate a Q factor to adjust the K factor for AC circuits. I'm displaying some pertinent information here because I wanted you to be aware of it. But these calculations are beyond the introductory scope of this video. As always, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.